The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them.
This is the shadow box we're about to construct. It's made out of hard maple. You can pick a tiger stripe or some other type of figured maple, or you can go with a more plain maple like I did. Now we'll begin the construction on this project by working on the main case. The material for the sides, top, and bottom needs to be 5/8 of an inch thick. So I've gone through and planed each of the boards to their appropriate thickness. I then took the boards over to the jointer, straightened up one edge so that I've got a nice straight edge for my ripping operation at the table saw. Now I'm all ready to go through and start ripping each of the boards for the sides and tops and bottom to their appropriate width. I've taken the time to carefully lay out the locations where I want to make my cuts to make the pieces for the sides, top, and bottom. And what I'm looking for is the best grain. Now what I can do is go ahead and cut them off here at the compound miter saw. To cut the bevel on the front edges of the top and bottom, I've moved my fence to the other side of the blade and tilted the blade over at about 37 degrees, maybe just a little bit more. Then near the bottom edge or the top surface of the table, I've set the rip fence over 1/4 of an inch from the inside edge of the saw blade. Now we can go ahead and cut that bevel. Now to cut the curve on the front edge of the top and bottom, we need to lay out that curve on there. And that curve will be a 1/2 inch back on both edges, and then of course nice and flush up here at the center. So I've placed some layout marks on my workpiece. Now one of my favorite layout tools is what I call a bow, and it's just like a bow and arrow bow, a thin strip of wood with a string on it. You draw tension on that string and you can vary the curvature. Now what I'll do is I'll place the bow on top of my board that we want to cut that radius on, or that curve, and I'll line up those 3 control points. I can use the one as a template to draw the curve on the other one. When cutting that curve, I'm going to make sure I leave the layout line on the piece because I will have to sand that up to smooth it out. Now to smooth out that curve on here, we'll use the disc sander. Here at the router table, I've installed a 1/4 inch diameter solid carbide router bit. I've raised it up 1/4 inch above the table, and because on our top and bottom we have to make a stopped cut, what I'm going to do is I'll slide the 2 pieces of wood here, this is actually the top and bottom, up against the router bit. And what I want to do is transfer the leading and trailing edges of the router bit and make a mark, transfer that mark up onto my fence. I know where the leading and trailing edge of that router bit is. So what I can do, I can bring my piece down on top of the router bit, feed across, stop at the leading edge of the router bit, and then lift the piece of wood off. And that will give me a stopped dado. The two side pieces also need that groove machined along the back edge, but in this case we can start right off the end of the board and continue all the way through. It's not a stop dado. The sides of our cabinet need to have a series of holes drilled in it to support the shelves. Now to do that, I'll be using a piece of perforated hardboard as a template to drill these holes. So now what I'll do is I'll take this template and use double-faced tape to hold it onto the side of our cabinet. I've got a stop set on the end to help me line that edge up, and then I'll just line one edge of this template flush with one edge of my board. Over here at the drill press, I've installed one of those self-centering drill bits that's used for installing hinges. This particular unit has a 7/64 diameter drill bit. Now I've set my depth stop so that I'm only drilling in about 5/16 of an inch into the edge of the board. To transfer the template from the one piece to the other, I want to make sure I'm referencing off the same edge, in this case the bottom edge on both pieces, and this being the front edge of our board. So I'll take my template, I'll flip it over and put the opposite face against the opposite side. Now at this point our holes are only 7/64 in diameter. An 1/8 inch pin won't fit in there. So I've installed an 1/8 inch drill bit, set my depth stop to go into that 5/16 depth, and I'll re-drill each of the holes. And I should point out that I'm not using a brad point bit, I'm using a standard point drill bit. And that will help to keep the drill bit on the location that we've already drilled. Now you can go out and purchase 1/8 inch diameter by 5/8 inch long dowel pins at some industrial supply houses. However, if you can't do that because there isn't one in your area, you can make your own shelf pins out of 1/8 inch brass rod. And to do that, I've got a very simple jig here. It's nothing more than a board with an 1/8 inch hole drilled through it this way so I can insert my stock. And then about 5/8 of an inch over from one edge, I've taken my hacksaw and cut a kerf line down through that cross hole. Now all I need to do, slide my piece in and saw it off to length. Now at this point, you've probably got a nice sharp edge at the end of our little shelf pins. To clean that up, I'll chuck it up in my electric drill, and then I'll spin it against the moving belt on my belt sander. The back panel is 1/4 inch maple plywood. Don't hesitate to substitute 1/4 inch birch plywood for this application. Now I've already ripped it to width, and now I can cut it off to length here at the table saw using my shop-made panel cutting jig. With the case out of the way, now we can turn our attention to working on the door. I've already selected the material that I'll be making the stiles and rails of for the door. Now it's just a matter of starting out by ripping each of the pieces to their proper width. At this point, I'm just trimming them up to their rough overall length. I've left them about a 1/2 inch long. I'm getting ready now for the first of 2 cuts that will be used to create the rabbet to receive the glass panel. I've set my rip fence at 3/16 of an inch and raised my saw blade up 3/8 of an inch. I've also installed a feather board to help keep the board we're cutting tight against the fence. Now when we pass these stiles and rails over the cutter, we want to make sure that we've got our outside face, the forward face, against the fence, and then the inside edge down against the table surface. And now for the second cut to complete that rabbet. I've set my rip fence at 7/8 of an inch and raised the blade up to 7/16. Now we'll be passing the board through with the outside edge against the fence and the inside face against the saw table. With the miter gauge swung around to 45 degrees, I'll make the 1 miter cut on each of the 4 pieces. I'm getting ready now to cut the other miter joint. I've swung my miter gauge around to the other side of 45 degrees, and I've installed a stop block. Now, not only do we need to have these miters at exactly 45 for a good tight joint, but we have to make sure that the 2 opposing sides of our square are each identical lengths. So the top and bottom have to be exactly the same length, and the 2 sides have to be exactly the same length. And that's the importance of a stop block in this operation. As you can see, we're assembling the frame at this point. This is somewhat of a temporary assembly. I know that these miter joints just glued like this won't be strong enough to hold everything together. Then I'll clamp it up good and tight and let this sit for about 2-3 hours. I do want that glue to have as strong a bond as possible so that when we reinforce this joint a little bit later, it won't fall apart during that operation. Now, if you don't have these fancy miter clamps like this, you can of course use a band clamp. Now that the glue's had a chance to set up on our door frame, I've installed it here in my tenon jig and tilted it back at 45 degrees. I then set the face of the tenon jig so that it's 1/4 inch away from the blade and raise my saw blade up to 1 1/8 inches. And now what I want to do is make a kerf cut through that miter joint, and in there we're going to put in a little spline, and that will greatly reinforce that joint. For the splines, to reinforce that miter joint, I'll be making mine out of maple. Now, of course, many woodworkers like to use a contrasting color of wood, such as walnut or wenge, for example, to make these splines. However, I want mine to be less noticeable, so I'm going to be using maple. Now, I've raised my saw blade up a little bit higher, and I've set it at 1/8 of an inch away from the blade, and we need that spline to be 1/8 inch wide to fit the kerf of my 1/8 inch saw blade. I've also installed a feather board, and that will help keep our board tight against the fence while we make this cut. Now to finish cutting away our spline material, I've lowered my saw blade and moved my rip fence over, and now I can take that final cut. I then took my spline material and cut out some small triangles, and we can insert those into our kerf cuts. Apply a liberal amount of glue. Make sure you cover the surface thoroughly. Slide it in place, and if needed, you can throw a clamp on there. Looking closely at both the left and right edges of the door, you'll notice that there's a very subtle detail here. It's a chamfer, and it does not continue from top to bottom, but rather it actually exists in a curvature. So it adds an awful lot of interest to the edge of the door. To mill that detail, we're going to be needing a template. Now I'm using a 1/4 inch thick piece of hardboard, and I've gone through and put on my 3 control points to do that layout. Up near the top of your screen, you'll see a line here, and near the bottom of your screen, you'll see another line. Those are 21 7/8 inches apart. I drew another line right at the center of those 2 positions, and then drew another line 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. Then I drew tension on that bow until I got the curvature to meet up at these 3 points. Now to cut that radius chamfer along the edge of our door, I've installed a collar along with a veining bit, and that collar will follow along our template. No magic powers here, just a couple of magnets that are very, very strong, and they're called rare earth magnets. They're about 1/8 inch thick and about 5/16 inch in diameter, and we're going to use these as our door catch to hold our door closed. Now, as a fair warning, if you use a pacemaker, you may not want to use these magnets. According to the warning label, you should avoid using these high-powered magnets around pacemakers. To install these magnets, I've drilled two 3/8 inch diameter holes about 1/4 inch deep. And those are about 4 inches up from each end. 2 holes in the side, 2 holes in the stile of the door. Now what we're going to do is glue these inside that hole and then plug it up with a piece of maple. Here at the drill press you can see I've installed a plug cutting bit, and it's a 3/8 inch plug cutter. Now I'll go ahead and drill a series of plugs that are at least 1/8 inch thick. Over here at the bandsaw, I can free up my plugs. Now we do want to make sure that we get these magnets in their proper orientation so that they hold the door shut instead of opened. So be very careful on this operation. And then a little bit more glue, and then we'll put the plugs in on top. We'll let the glue dry and sand them up flush. For hinges, I'm using brass butt hinges. I'll be setting them up so that they're 2 inches up from the bottom and 2 inches down from the top. And they will have to be mortised in, so I'll be using my mortising jig that I've built a number of years ago and continue to use it to this day. And a little bit of handwork to remove the round corners from the router bit, we've got our mortising done. Because these two biscuit slots will establish the width or the separation between the two sides, it was very important to carefully set the distance for the fence on the biscuit joiner to position that slot. In fact, I was so careful with it, I even set it up on a scrap piece of wood first to make sure I get that slot in exactly the right position. And everything fits up good at this point. Now it's time for some finish sanding. We want to get that out of the way before assembly. With the sanding out of the way, it's time for some assembly. I'll start out by applying some glue in each of the biscuit slots, getting that spread around nicely. And then I'll apply a little bit of glue at the end of the two side pieces, bring everything together and clamp it up good. No glue on the back panel, just let it float. And we'll just throw a couple clamps on here and let it sit for a couple hours. I'm getting ready now to make the 1/4 round molding that will serve as our glass stop. Now I've installed a 1/4 inch radius roundover bit, and I'll be working with a larger board to make it a safer operation. And now I'll start making the first of 2 cuts to separate our 1/4 round molding. Here you can see already I've made these cuts. And all I've got is my saw blade set up at about 3/8 of an inch, my rip fence set at 1/4 of an inch, and a feather board to help hold the board we're cutting tight against the fence. I've carefully set the rip fence so that I've got 1/4 inch of material between the blade and the outside edge of my piece. And of course these are the 1/4 round pieces that we're trying to get. For my door pull, I've selected Wenge as my hardwood. It's a nice dark African wood and it'll provide a nice contrast against our light maple cabinet. Now I've already ripped it to 3/4 of an inch wide. It was 3/8 of an inch thick, so I didn't have to do any work there, and I cut it off to a length of 3.5 inches. To lay out the radius on there, we need a 2.5 inch radius. Now my sanding discs happen to be 5 inches in diameter. And now we can refine the shape here at the disc sander. door pull's simply going to get glued on in place. Now I've put a couple of blocks on here to act as stops when I position the pull on there and to make sure that I've got it parallel to the stile. I've centered it vertically, top to bottom, and then I've centered it left to right at the center point on the flat area of our stile. Now I'll just carefully position that in place. Now with it clamped securely in place, I'll let it sit for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll remove my stop blocks, and I'll check for glue squeeze out and clean it up if necessary. The finish that I've selected is a tung oil, and I'm just going to flood it on the project generously, get it good and wet. I'll let it soak in for about 5 or 10 minutes, wipe off the excess with a dry rag. Then I'll sand lightly between coats, and I'll probably apply about 3 or 4 coats of the tung oil. When working with tung oil, I find that this step is probably one of the most critical, in that you want to wipe off all the excess so that you have an even sheen. Or perhaps we should rephrase that to an even dullness. You don't want to leave any puddling or very wet spots, because those will dry much different and your finish will look much different in those spots. My glass supplier suggested that we use 1/8 inch thick glass for the door panel. So they've cut that out for us, and now we're installing that using this 1/4 round molding. And I'll be cutting it to length over at the table saw. I've already got 3 pieces fit in. Now I can mark the last piece for length, cut it off, and we can finish installing the glass. And we can tack the 1/4 round molding in place with some micro pin nails. If you don't have a pin nailer, you can use a couple of drops of a silicone adhesive to help hold this in place. After carefully marking the hole locations for the hinges, we can drill those out, being very careful not to drill through to the front of the frame. And we can tighten up the screws using a screwdriver. Now the only thing left to do is to find a place in your home to hang the shadow box on the wall somewhere. Then to take some of your favorite pieces and proudly display them in the shadow box. I'm Chris DeHut. Thanks for watching.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.